I'm going to start by showing you a backwards loop cast-on, which is probably the easiest of all the cast-ons. It's sometimes called an E cast-on because what you're doing is making a shape like a lowercase letter E and sticking that onto the needle and tightening it. So start with a slip knot. That's just where you, again, make that lowercase letter E and pull the yarn through. This is the tail end of the yarn on my left side, and the working side is attached to the ball of yarn over here on the right. So I'm going to stick that onto the needle, just one of the needles, and tighten that up. And to make the backwards loop cast on, hold your working yarn in your right hand and just hold it over your index finger and turn it away from you. Stick that on the needle and tighten it up. So watch what you're doing. You're making a lowercase letter E, sticking that on the needle and tightening it up. And you just repeat that until you have as many stitches as you need to cast on your needle. So try to keep these neat. It's going to be hard to do. This isn't the neatest cast on in the world, and I'll show you what it looks like in a second after you've knit a few rows. But it is probably the easiest cast on. So again, yarn in the right hand, turn it away from you, put it on the needle, and tighten. Okay, so I've finished using my backwards loop or E cast on, and I knit a few rows in stockinette. I just wanted to show you how it looks. So see the bottom edge here? It's a little bit decorative. There's a bit of a loopy appearance to it. I don't know if you can see that right at the bottom there. But it is, like I said, not the most stable or neat cast on, but there are situations where you'd want to cast on like this. It actually is very stretchy. You can stretch it and not lose the integrity there at the bottom. It kind of stretches to accommodate it. It doesn't get all puckered looking. If you wanted a really stretchy edge, or if you're knitting lace where you know you're going to be blocking it and the finished piece is going to stretch out a lot, you might want a cast on like this that's going to give you that room to stretch. Or you might want to be putting fringe on the end of a garment or a scarf, and this backwards loop cast on leaves a nice open edge to do that. But you just want to be aware that this is definitely one of the looser looking cast-ons. So our second cast-on is called the long tail cast-on, and it's called that because you start with a slip knot usually, and that goes around your needle, and you're working with a long tail of yarn, and you're working with the other yarn that's coming from the ball. So usually it's difficult to estimate what you're going to need for the long tail, and I promise you I've definitely misestimated and run out with only a few stitches left to cast on. I've run out of tail yarn, and it's really frustrating. Sometimes I've knotted on new yarn or spit spliced some on, but actually I learned a few tricks that have prevented me from running out of yarn, so I'll share those with you. One thing you can do is measure an inch of yarn for every stitch that you'll need. So if you know you need to cast on 40, just measure 40 inches of yarn. You can kind of just do this to estimate, measuring an inch out. I've also heard that you can wrap the yarn around the needle to estimate, one time for every stitch, or 2 times probably for every stitch. I would always err on the side of too much yarn. And then another trick, my favorite, is figure out how wide your piece is that you're knitting. So let's say you're knitting a cardigan front, and let's say it's for a bear or a baby, and it's only going to be about 6 inches wide. So I'm going to estimate that way. And you want to do 3 times the amount of the piece. I always do 1 extra. So just to review that, say this is 6 inches wide, I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4 for good measure. Another tip about the long tail cast on is that it can often be a little tight, so once you're done working it, it's a little difficult to knit that first row. You can prevent that by knitting with 2 needles held together. Either 2 of your needles, or if you have a smaller needle that you're going to work the ribbing on, and your larger body needle, you can use those 2. And you're just going to put your slip knot around both of them. Oops. Like that. And work as though you're working on 1 needle. It's a little awkward, but then you take out 1 needle at the end and you've got kind of a little more room to get your needle in. Whenever I'm teaching the long tail cast on, I usually call it the slingshot cast on, and that's because of the way you have to position the yarn in your hand. It sort of looks like a slingshot. So start by making a slip knot. Oops. Tighten it up on the needle. You've got your long tail to the right of you and the working yarn to the left. And then you're going to position the yarn in your hand like so. So stick your thumb underneath it, and the yarn goes over your index finger as well, and bunch it together with your pinky at the bottom. So that's sort of where you get your slingshot, like that. And then you're going to go with your needle, dive underneath the thumb yarn, underneath the index finger yarn, and pull it back in through the thumb loop, nudge it off the thumb, and tighten that up. I know that's a lot, so I'm going to do this again really slowly. So, position your yarn, you're grabbing it down at the bottom with your ring finger and pinky like so, you're holding it open with your index finger and your thumb, you're going under the thumb loop, under the index loop, going back into that thumb loop, and then letting it fall off your thumb and tightening it up. And then it's naturally going to fall into place it'll all reposition. Let's watch that again. Under, under, back, off the thumb, and tighten up. And see, you're ready to do another. It's really key to get this hand motion down because it'll make it go really fast. See? It's all one fluid motion. Tighten it up, and it's right back on the thumb. So underneath that thumb loop, underneath the index one, back into the thumb loop, off the thumb, tighten, and you can just tighten it up by scooping it with your thumb, and then you're right back in position to make another stitch. Something Nora showed me, I started the cast on with a slip knot before, but Nora showed me that you don't actually have to do that. You can just get your yarn into position in the slingshot, go underneath this first loop here, hold it in place, and start in with your cast on. Something I want to point out, if this cast on looks a little complicated and involved, that's because it is. It isn't just a cast on, you're actually knitting the first row. So you can't really see it on this side, but if you flip it over, you can see there's a row of purl bumps. So that's, of course, the back side of a knit stitch is a purl stitch right here. So you're looking at your first knit row. So when you start knitting on this side, if you're knitting stockinette stitch, just know that your first row here is actually a purl row. You're on the wrong side. If you've knit with the long tail cast on, if you've cast on all those stitches and flipped it over, you're starting on the wrong side of your garment. I actually like the way that the purl ridge looks at the bottom, and it kind of balances it out. If you're knitting stockinette stitch, you might want to start with a purl row, like so. I finished up that couple of rows, and I just wanted to show you the difference. Here I did my long tail cast on and I started knitting on the next row, making that the right side row for stockinette stitch, and you can see there's little purls at the bottom. That's the very first row. That's your long tail cast on. I love this look. If you didn't do that and you worked your long tail cast on and purled the first row as though it were a wrong side row, which it is, it's for stockinette stitch, you're going to have this knit stitch all the way to the bottom, and it's a really pretty little diagonal. It does curl a little bit, so just so you know, it's going to be a little more curly than working that long tail cast on and then starting to knit. This side isn't curling much at all. Lastly, I want to share a new to me trick that I heard about on the Stash and Burn Knitting podcast, and this one is genius. It's for when you're casting on a large number of stitches and you're really afraid of running out of yarn, which is super frustrating, and you don't feel like using any of the estimation tricks that I use because there's just so many stitches. So what you're going to do is wind yourself a center pole ball of yarn, if it doesn't already come wound that way, and using the yarn from the outside and the center, you're going to just hold those two together. You can make a slip knot or a regular knot. Put that on the needle like this. That's going to count as 2 stitches. And then it doesn't really matter which yarn is which here. You're just going to start your long tail cast on as I showed you before. And you can already see the beauty of this. The yarn supply is coming from the ball of yarn, and unless you're casting on 1,000 stitches, I really can't see running out mid cast on with this method. So after you've cast on however many stitches you need, you're just going to cut that extra yarn and start knitting with whichever strand you choose.